Hi folks, hi everyone. Welcome back to Karen Vibes. Sorry I've been out so long. I didn't realize that it had been a month since I haven't done any reading, but welcome back. Yeah, I've been busy and there's a lot of stuff getting done. My apologies for being out so long. So I want to finish reading this book, Minty Ali, and move on to some other interesting books. I can never get this. Stay still. So welcome everyone. Welcome to Karen Vibes. Hope you're all doing okay despite everything that's happening around us and the world going crazy. Hope you're all doing well and just keeping your heads in there, just hanging in there. Whatever that you're going through, you're just keeping your heads up. Keeping your heads up. Alright, so we're just gonna get right into it. So as I normally do, grab your cup of tea. You can grab your cup of K's spicy teas. Either you want to grab a cup of lemongrass, bay leaf, pimento, which other one? And soursop. So that's bay leaf, pimento, lemongrass, and soursop. You can grab a cup of tea, or you can grab a cool drink. You can actually make iced tea with those teas too. And just sit back, relax, and enjoy my reading. The book that we're reading is Minty Ali. If you're new, if you go on my YouTube page, Karen Vibes, you can follow from there. And those who are regulars, just continue to listen. Welcome to those who have joined. Welcome. Welcome. All right, so we had read chapter 18, and we finished chapter 18, and now we're at chapter 19. So the name of our book is Minty Ali. Minty Ali, written by C.L.R. James and narrated by moi, Karen Ware. So we're just going to get right into it without further ado. Alright, so where we left off the last time, we were reading about how Miss Haynes, so Mrs. Rose was complaining to Mr. Haynes how Maisie was rude and have no manners and what have you. And that, so we had stopped there. So as I say, you want to follow the story, just go on my YouTube page, Karen Vibes. So that's KAREN VIBES with an exclamation sign, and you can follow the story. Alright, so let's get into it. Chapter 19. Haynes went to see Ella one day and came back to number 2. Rather grave. Ella was no better and was going to the country to be taken care of by her mother. She had not wanted to go and held on to the last minute. But Haynes insisted, for her condition was obvious. Ella had hinted that he should move. She said she had a friend who would be able to take her place. "You are afraid, Ella, that they will take me away from you. But don't be afraid. That is impossible. You remember how the nurse tried and I put a stop to it?" Ella had left it at that, but slyly and respectfully, yet very firmly, she had examined Haynes about how much money he gave Mrs. Rose, and what she gave him to eat, and how long the money lasted, and all the various things which she used to manage. "Everything is all right, isn't it, Ella? Everything is all right, isn't it, Ella?" And Ella had to admit that everything was. So Ella is sick. So Ella was his help, and then she got sick, so she's not there with them anymore. So she's questioning Mr. Haynes about what's happening and what have you. But walking home, Haynes had been driven to think of a few things which had never crossed his mind before. Mrs. Rose, he knew, was in great straits. Where formerly Ben, Archer, and Wilma helped, now there was only Phyllis, who had more to do with every succeeding day. Now and then Mrs. Rose engaged a boy, but usually he stole the cakes. That is so funny. So now and then Mrs. Rose engaged a boy, but usually he stole the cake. So Miss Rose get a little boy to help her in the kitchen, but this little boy that stopped steal out the cakes. Some of them complained of the heat of the kitchen, and they were sometimes very rude when Mrs. Rose asked them, as she often had to do, to wait a few days before they were paid. And then, too, there was no denying that Mrs. Rose was a difficult woman to work with in these days. Haynes recalled certain frantic efforts on mornings to borrow a shilling here or 18 pence there to help in the making of cakes. There were times when Mrs. Rose would be walking up and down the yard, waiting anxiously for Phyllis to find out if her efforts to secure credit for flour or sugar had been successful. He had no right to be adding the burden of his business on hers. And once he began to think that, he thought over it with ever increasing dissatisfaction with himself and a feeling that he should put his business right at once. When he reached home, he called Phyllis and told her that he wanted to speak to her about something rather important. Phyllis asked if it would take long. Haynes said he thought it would. He would thrash the matter out thoroughly with Phyllis and then speak to Mrs. Rose. Phyllis said that Mrs. Rose had friends. Haynes could hear them in Miss Atwell's room next door. She was busy cleaning up the kitchen, but in half an hour she would be finished and then she would come. Haynes had barely finished talking to Phyllis when Maisie came into the room. You all know that it seems as if Haynes has her eyes, Haynes has a thing for Maisie. So Maisie comes into the room. By the way, Maisie, said Haynes, Mrs. Rose's business is giving her more trouble than before. Business is going worse. What is that to me? Said Maisie. Business could go smash as far as I care. And besides, Mrs. Rose is all right, Mr. Haynes. She has a man running after her now. What? Said Haynes. Yes, he's a police. That's like we said, this little girl mix up, you see? This young lady's so mixed up. Yes, he's a policeman. What sort of man is he? A man, Mr. Haynes. What sort of man you expect him to be? Some old funk? I often wonder how old people make love. Love is a matter for young people. People like you and me, Mr. Haynes. But see, I said, Mr. This girl is so out of order. And Mr. Boyce, said Haynes. Haynes had surprised himself by the good temper and generosity with which he had drawn aside and allowed himself to be defeated by Boyce in the race for Maisie's affections. Maisie did not answer at once. She merely shrugged her shoulders. But I haven't seen him around here for some time, Maisie, and you're not going to see him either, said Maisie. I suppose now that he has got what he was bothering me for, he is not coming back here again. And having said that, this almost with anger, Maisie's mood changed and she smiled mysteriously to herself with a touch of scorn and gave Haynes time to consider it. Haynes, after the first shock, reacted strongly. He considered what Maisie had said. He also considered Maisie. Her confession of Boyce's success fired his imagination, and now Boyce was gone. There was a touch of repulsion at the idea of so quickly succeeding someone else, and that person a friend of his. But Haynes badly wanted to start making love to someone, here you know, and he was as certain as he could be that Maisie would not repulse his advances. So Hazy would not repulse his advances, was inviting him to make some. There she was, leaning forward in the rocking chair, waiting. Her lower lip pouted a little in vexation, but that was as it should be. Haynes saw himself soothing the scowl into a shy smile, and at the end, Maisie sleeping peacefully in his arms. Why not do something now? But she was too far away. He was sitting on the bed. If she were sitting next to him, no one would be able to see, as it was if he went over to her. Then, Phyllis might be able to see them from the kitchen. Hard lines. He glanced at the door and considered the angle. Tori, come to bump. Have a cigarette, Mr. Haynes, said Maisie. Let me light it for you. And she brought it for him and sat down on the bed beside him. She lit the cigarette but did not move. Haynes puffed twice and then put it on the table. Now he was in the very list of love. Maisie lifted the cigarette from the table and put it in the ashtray. When she brought her hand back, she put it on the bed. Haynes could feel it resting against his leg. She left it there. Now certainly was the time, said Haynes to himself. Better hold her hand first so as not to startle her. If he acted too suddenly, she might scream or utter a cry, and those next door might hear. Yes, he had to guard against that. There was a lot of talking and laughing next door. But if he startled Maisie in any way and she shrieked, they would certainly ask what was that. His hand moved furtively towards her. There was a sudden lull in the conversation next door. Haynes stopped at once. Better wait until they began again. He stole a glance at Maisie. She was leaning forward, her eyes on the table before her. But as he looked at her, although she did not look at him, he knew that she had seen him, for she swayed towards him, and he felt her body lean slightly against his. The talking and chattering started next door. Haynes looked at Maisie's hand. He would hold it first and then not say a word, but merely put his arms around her waist and draw her to him. He would do it. He would. Mr. Haynes, Mr. Haynes, Mr. Haynes, came Phyllis' clear voice from outside. I'll be ready in 5 minutes. Very well, Phyllis, said Haynes. As soon as you are ready. He got up quickly from the bed. Have a cigarette, Maisie, he said. He held a match for her with his fingers and trembled. Maisie had given no sign, but as the match shook in Haynes' fingers, she held his wrist to steady it. Thank you, Mr. Haynes, she said, without looking at him. If Phyllis is coming in here, I am going out. Is she going to stay long? Everybody knows that Maisie and Phyllis don't agree. Maisie is not nice to Phyllis, Maisie is not nice to Phyllis. So she's asking Mr. Haynes, is she going to stay too long? Not too long, said Haynes. I'll come back later, she said, and she left. But before she left, she gave him one long farewell look, which was at once a reminder, an invitation, and a promise of good things to come. So obviously she wants to sleep with him too. Haynes began by referring to Ella's continued absence. Phyllis had brought in some sewing. Sorry, Phyllis had brought in some laundry, but she put it aside and stopped him at once. I hope you're not thinking of getting somebody in her place, Mr. Haynes. And when he did not answer, she shook her head decisively. No, Mr. Haynes. Busy as you see, Mrs. Rose. If you stop the cooking, it will hurt her too much. She will think something displease you. They could talk freely as the laughing, animated conversation still went on next door. Mrs. Rose, happy. Phyllis looked up and smiled. I'm glad to hear her laughing. She have enough trouble, poor woman. That is why. You have nothing to do with that, Mr. Haynes. We are all glad to do anything for you. But things are really bad all the same. Christmas coming and I don't know what sort of Christmas the madam going to spend. What about you and Christmas? Me, Mr. Haynes, I'm alright. Me, Mr. Haynes, I'm alright. As long as my man don't get jealous and cause me anxiety. Nothing trouble me. Eyes, Mrs. Rose. Nothing trouble me. Eyes, Mrs. Rose. Is Mrs. Rose I studying? Mr. Ben gone. She going to miss him this Christmas and then no money to buy anything at all. Mrs. Rose like nice wine and stout. She don't eat much, but she like to drink on a spree day. Christmas long ago, she and Mr. Ben used to have champagne and Guinness stout mixed. Do you drink? Me? No. One Christmas, the first Christmas I spent with Mrs. Rose, I drink some champagne. I get sick. I threw up. I couldn't eat for the day. And not me again. You eat well though. Long time, but my appetite going now. I can't eat the stale cake, you know, Mr. Haynes, and Mrs. Rose does cook only once a day. Sometimes she don't cook at all for the day. Not cook at all for the day? It was incredible. Why? That is nothing. But hasn't she cooked for me? Yes, but that is different. She must cook for you. You'll give her money. And what do you all eat? Any little thing. We cook sometimes, but if we only get money to make cake for the parlor, we can't get anything. You know how goons can quarrel if anything wrong. We make tea every morning and we credit milk from the cooling man to pay at the end of the month. If I feel hungry, I credit ice cream cone when I going down the road and eat it. I like ice cream, you know, but often I'm so busy I haven't time to think about food. But why don't you credit at a shop, said Haynes. And knew even before he was told that he had asked a stupid question. Credit at a shop? If you know how the messages the man at the shop does give me to bring to Mrs. Rose, if she owe him a dollar, I don't tell her because I don't want to worry her. Phyllis! It was Mrs. Rose calling. Come in, Mrs. Rose. Come in, ma'am. Good night, Mr. Haynes. I hope you sleep well. As soon as Phyllis had gone, Maisie came back again. Closing the door behind her. Mr. Haynes, I heard them next door giving Mrs. Rose jokes about her new sweetheart. But Mr. Haynes had other things than Maisie to think about now. I'm sorry, Maisie, but I find I have something very important to do. He bustled about the table with pen and paper. You will finish soon, Mr. Haynes? I'm afraid not, Maisie. All right, Mr. Haynes. See you tomorrow night, Mr. Haynes. Yes, Maisie. Haynes would not look around, glad to be rid of her. When she left, he locked the door and put down his pen. He was genuinely shocked at what Phyllis had so casually revealed. To the burden of Mrs. Rose's own overwhelming difficulties, he had, with unpardonable carelessness, added his own. It was all very well to throw his personal affairs upon Ella. That was Ella's job. He paid Ella far more than the average servant got. She was ill, and he still paid her her money. But Mrs. Rose and Maisie and the rest did between them everything that Ella had done. With Ella, he still had no regular system, but merely gave money, and when it was finished, gave some more. He always paid the money due on the mortgage from his weekly income and lived on the balance and the rent. Haynes was in a state of abject self-blame, and with good cause. Often when money was finishing, Mrs. Rose, just as Ella used to do, would say, "Mr. Haynes, how are things with you?" If it were late in the week, Haynes might say, as he did with Ella. On Sunday morning, Mrs. Rose, and perhaps it might be late Saturday night, before he gave it to her. Sometimes he would draw money on the Saturday and go off to the country, not returning until Monday morning, but never once, except one day when it rained from 3 in the morning to 10 o'clock without a break, was any meal late. And although his meals varied in quality, yet judging from Ella's standard, he got good value for the money. Morning, noon, and night, everything was ready, punctually on the table for him. Now and then he did not come for supper, and the food stayed till morning, some of it having to be thrown away. He had gone on his way, taking it all for granted. To what sacrifices had he put the good woman to feed him regularly while the rest of the household starved? He would have to do something about it. He would go into detail with Phyllis and then talk about it with Mrs. Rose. He would do it as soon as possible. Of course, he had never intended to do it that night. He had only wanted to get rid of Maisie. Maisie liked him obviously, but tonight was not the time for that sort of nonsense. When he had settled his business with Mrs. Rose, he felt that Maisie was good as his. He felt that Maisie was as good as his. Well. All right, so I'm going to pause there. I'm going to pause there and then come back, then upload to read chapter 20. So we're going to pause.